Today you're going to be hearing some amazing and provocative stories from innovators about their educational experiences and how those experiences shaped their creativity. In a few minutes, I'm going to be asking you to share some of your stories. I want to start by sharing mine. I think the first time I heard the word creativity, I was in kindergarten. My teacher had come to our home for the end of the year conference with my mother. I was a typical 5-year-old. I was eavesdropping from the next room. And I remember hearing my beloved Mrs. Bowyer say to my mom at one point, "I think Teresa shows a lot of potential for artistic creativity, and I hope that's something she really develops over the years." Well, I was thrilled when I heard this, and I started looking forward to a lifetime as a creative artist. Unfortunately, that kindergarten year was kind of the high point of my artistic career. I've never really done anything with art after that, and I've wondered why over the years. I think it might have had something to do with the kind of educational experiences I had with art after that first year of education. So kindergarten for me was in a pretty progressive, open education style public school where we had a lot of free play time, and during that free play time we had great access to these wonderful art materials, and we could pretty much do whatever we wanted with them, and I spent a lot of time with them. Unfortunately, after that kindergarten year, my parents enrolled me in a very strict, traditional parochial school. I have a picture of it. There it is. Doesn't that look like fun? St. Joseph's Elementary School in North Tonawanda, New York. So at St. Joe's, art, rather than being something that we did as part of every day, art became a subject that we had once a week, Friday afternoons. I think the nuns were too tired to do anything else with us on Friday afternoons, so they said, okay, you're going to have art now. Every week we had the same kind of peculiar activity given to us. We all would get an identical small reprint of one of the great masterworks in painting. And let me show you one of these. Da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi. Okay, we got this in second grade, 8 years old. I think this was probably for art appreciation. Let's talk about the artist. Let's talk about what the artist was trying to convey. But no, that's not what we did. Instead, we were told week after week to take out our art materials and copy it. Copy it. No skill training whatsoever, and no materials any better than this. So this was an exercise in extreme frustration. And worse than that, we were very strictly graded on the monstrosities that we produced. At least mine were monstrosities. I couldn't even figure out how to get all of those horses and saints on the page, let alone make them look like horses and saints. There was only one time in all of those elementary school years that I even remember hearing the word creative. And that was, I think, in 7th grade. Her name was Sister Carmelita. The art prince hadn't shown up that week, so she told us to take out our art materials and do whatever we wanted with them. This was astonishing. Do whatever you want. So I decided that I would make something abstract, and I think it was a kind of abstract mosaic that I was making, and I was coloring with these very intense colors, having a ball doing this. I felt like a prisoner let out of jail. And I heard her walking up the aisle behind me. You know the feeling where you hear the teacher's footsteps coming up, and then she stopped. I heard her stop right behind my desk, and she looked down at what I was doing. She sniffed, and she said, "I think maybe we're being a little too creative." I was absolutely mortified when she said this, loud enough for everybody to hear. I viewed her as kind of a cruel person. I viewed myself as ridiculous and incompetent. I was angry, I was embarrassed, and I lost all motivation for doing anything in art after that point. So I started studying creativity in children, but about 30 years ago, I started studying creativity in adults at work. In an an adult in the workplace, I would call that experience that I had in elementary school, I would call that bad inner work life. And let me tell you what I mean by inner work life. Inner work life is the combination of perceptions, emotions, and motivations that people experience as they react to and try to make sense of events at work. Perceptions are just your impressions, your judgments, your thoughts about what's happening and what it means. Your emotions, of course, are your emotional reactions to what's going on. Could be positive, negative, could be intense or mild. And your motivation is your drive to do what you're doing. We focus in particular on intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the motivation to do something because it's interesting, enjoyable, satisfying, personally challenging. You can think of intrinsic motivation in its extreme form as passion for what you're doing. We focus on that because we found that intrinsic motivation is the key, crucial motivation for creativity. So those experiences that I had with art class in elementary school were situations that pretty much killed my inner work life for creativity, at least in art. But the story ends well, because when I left elementary school and entered high school, there was a teacher who rekindled my inner work life, especially my intrinsic motivation for creativity, in science this time. In Donna Luther's terms, I guess you would consider Sister Felicia my trumpeter. She showed me that science wasn't what I had a preconceived notion of. I didn't really get exposure to science in elementary school. I had thought of science as a set of facts that lived in a book. No, here's what she showed me. She showed me that science is fun. It's something you do. It's all about unlocking mysteries. It's a way of thinking. It's not a dead, moldering body of facts. Scientists ask and answer cool questions, and they figure out new mysteries to investigate. This was exciting. This was something that I wanted to do. And I credit that woman, I credit Sister Felicia with sparking in me the passion for the psychological science that I've been doing for many, many years now, and the psychological science that I still love. So let me tell you a little bit about the psychological science that I did that led to the discovery of inner work life. And when I say I mean myself and a number of collaborators, and most especially my primary collaborator and co-author, Stephen Kramer, who's also my husband. Okay, so Steve and I and our collaborators decided that the best way to understand the hearts and minds of people as they're trying to do creative work would be to solicit confidential, daily electronic diaries from people working inside organizations on important creative projects during the entire course of the project. So this is what we did. After we recruited people to be in the study, every day while they were working on an important innovation project inside their company, we asked them to respond to an email link that we sent them to a short daily diary form. It asked them about their experiences that day. On average, people were in the study for 4.5 months because we tried to follow them from the first day of the project to the last day of the project. Let me tell you about the database that we've got here. We studied 3 industries, 7 companies within those industries, a total of 26 creative teams, 238 professionals in those teams. And when I say creative teams, I mean these were teams of people who were supposed to be doing work that would yield novel and useful solutions that could actually be implemented within their companies. We didn't know when we started studying these projects which ones would actually be successful in yielding creative solutions that could be implemented and which ones wouldn't. That's why it was so exciting to be able to study it while it was unfolding. We ended up with nearly 12,000 days of data, 12,000 individual daily diary entries. This was a treasure trove of data. We had data of a number of different types. First of all, the daily diary form got numerical ratings of people's inner work lives. So every day we had short scale ratings where they told us about their perceptions, their emotions, and their motivation that day. The most important question asked for a story. It said, briefly describe one event from today that stands out in your mind. It can be anything at all as long as it's relevant to the work or the project. Those are the stories that we analyzed. We also had separate numerical data on their performance. All 238 professionals, we had multiple ratings of their performance, creativity, productivity, and other dimensions from supervisors and coworkers. And when we put the performance data together with the inner work life data, we made our first discovery. We call it the inner work life effect. And that is that inner work life drives performance. We found that all three dimensions of inner work life have an effect on four dimensions of performance. I've highlighted intrinsic motivation and creativity because those are the primary dimensions that I'm focusing on today. But we found on those days and those weeks and those months when people are having the most positive inner work life, and that is positive perceptions of their organization and themselves, their colleagues, their bosses, when they're having the most pleasant emotions, and when they're experiencing the strongest intrinsic motivation for their work, when they feel really jazzed about their work, it's then that they're most likely to be creative in their work and productive. They're also most likely, at those times, to demonstrate commitment to the work and to be better colleagues to each other. In fact, we found in one of our analyses, get this, that when people are in a better emotional state on one day, not only are they more likely to come up with creative ideas that day, they're also more likely to come up with creative ideas the next day, regardless of the next day's emotional state. So we actually found an incubation effect in the field, a carryover effect. So if inner work life is so important for creativity, what drives inner work life? To answer this question, we delved back into those 12,000 diaries and we analyzed what kind of events were happening on people's very best inner work life days. And we found that there was one kind of event that stood out above all other positive events on the best inner work life days. This event that dominated was simply making progress in meaningful work. That's what we call the progress principle. The number one driver of inner work life is progress in meaningful work. We found that when people are moving forward on something that they care about, they're more likely to have those positive emotions, those positive perceptions, and the strong intrinsic motivation for what they're doing. I want to stress this meaningful work piece, because if people are moving forward on something that they don't care about, something that they consider just go for work, that's not going to facilitate their inner work life. But if the work is meaningful, that is, if they feel that their individual actions are contributing to something that they value, then even making incremental progress, what we call a small win, can boost inner work life tremendously. So think about what I'm saying. This means that when people make progress in meaningful work, that is going to enhance their intrinsic motivation. They are going to be more jazzed about the work that they're doing, and that is going to lead to higher levels of creativity. And we find these positive spirals happening sometimes. We found them in the best teams and the best organizations where people were in positive inner work life state. That made it more likely that they would make progress on their work, that is, that they would be creative and productive, and that in turn led them to have better inner work life. So they fed each other. We have a positive feedback loop going on. Now, unfortunately, all of this happens in the negative direction, too. So the strongest, the most frequent, prominent event on the worst inner work-life days is having setbacks in the work, feeling that you're being blocked or stalled somehow in your most important work, or even feeling like you're moving backwards. Those events dominate on the worst inner work-life days, and you can get negative spirals where people are not able to make progress on meaningful work. That degrades their inner work life, and that makes it less likely that they're going to make progress that is be productive, be creative in the future. And you can get these death spirals going on, which we also saw in some of the teams and some of the companies that we studied. So I've been focusing here primarily on intrinsic motivation, but there are two other components of creativity that I want to highlight for you, because when I ask you to think about your own educational experiences and your own creativity, I want you to keep all three components in mind. The first is expertise, and that is simply having technical skills, talents, various kinds of expertise in the domain in which you're trying to be creative. Creativity skills are those skills that are taught so well through the Creative Education Foundation, and those are ways of thinking, ways of taking new perspectives on problems, ways of looking at the world that will help you to come up with novel and useful solutions in any domain in which you're working. The third component is the one that I've focused on in my own research, and that's intrinsic task motivation. That's being fired up about what you're doing it because it's interesting, enjoyable, it's personally challenging in some ways. I don't mean to say it's easy, but it's something that you feel you must do, something that you deeply want to do. The creativity intersection is where all three of these come together. That's the space where you're most likely to be creative, and that is where your best expertise, that is your strongest talents, and your training intersect with your creativity skills and with your strongest intrinsic motivation. That's where you're most likely to do your best creative work. So I'm going to ask you now to think about your own creativity stories. Here are some guidelines for you. This is for anyone in the audience who's not going to be up here on the stage talking about their own stories today, okay? So I'm going to ask you to think about a specific story, a specific event that you can describe to the rest of us in a few sentences, a teacher or an educational experience from your youth that had a significant impact on your creativity. Could be positive or negative. My story had both pieces. Started out with the negative, ended up with the positive. And how did it have a significant impact on you? Did it have an impact on your intrinsic motivation? An impact on the meaning that you found in what you were doing? Did it impact your expertise, the development of your talents, your skills? Was there an impact perhaps on your creative thinking skills? Your ability to take new perspectives on problems, to think freely, to take some risks with what you're doing? Did it have an impact on your sense of progress, or maybe some other element that you feel strongly influenced your creativity? So I'm going to give you about 1 minute to just think about your own story, and then we'll ask for a couple of volunteers to briefly describe theirs. Okay, so just take a few seconds to think it through. Dory, go ahead. This is Dr. Doris Shellcross, former head of the Creative Education Foundation Board.
Hi. What came to mind when Teresa suggested that was when I think I was in 7th grade, and we had an English teacher who was very strict, and no one would ever take a chance on anything in her class. And so I decided to be a smart aleck one day and write a composition that was quite different and hand it in. And lo and behold, she picked my composition to read aloud, and I thought she was going to really rip into me because the title was The Zipper and the Eyelash. And it was a true story how I caught my eyelash in a zipper. And she loved it. And so it encouraged me to take a lot more risks in writing, and writing became my favorite thing.
I love that story because kids who are trying to be creative in school often are kind of troublemakers. And I have the sense that you were trying to tweak her maybe a little bit in writing that story and trying to be a little bit of a troublemaker. And you didn't get into the trouble that you thought you would, right? Okay, great. That's a wonderful story.
My story always makes people think I'm a little bit crazy, but when I was in probably about 6th or 7th grade, I was doing a 4-H project related to Ohio birds, and I had just ridden my bike home from the library, and I saw a dead bird on the side of the road. And I had a little plastic bag in my backpack, and I scooped it into the bag, and I brought it home, and I declared to my mother, I want to boil the bird and put its skeleton together as part of my project. And my mom looked at me and said, okay, but you're going to have to do it on the grill in the backyard because that is not coming in the house. And I did. She gave me an old pan, and I boiled the bird in the backyard and got every single bone out of it and put the entire skeleton together and hung it from a little thing I made out of tree branches. And during the project, talked to the judge about the weight of the bones and their fragile nature, and sort of how incredulous it is that something like that can fly. And I ended up winning the project, but it was also just the idea that you can do so much with what's dead on the side of the road as part of your education.
So Jackie's story brings two things to mind. One is that there was something in your experience that had led you to say, I'm going to look for whatever I can. Was that your teacher? Was that a series of teachers? Was that your home environment, do you think?
It was a little bit a series of teachers, and then also I had just grown up where I was frequently allowed to go play in the woods and build forts, and the group of kids that I ran around with in my neighborhood did that on a regular basis, so we were always into something. I was getting hosed off in the backyard before I could go in the house when I got home at night.
So what I'm hearing here is that Jackie's important educational experiences for creativity didn't all come from school, right? There were teachers. It was the formal educational environment that was positive, but it was also that home environment. It was mother as teacher, right? And mother who said, I don't like it so much, it's a little icky, I don't want it in the house, but do it, Jackie, do it. You know, go out in the backyard and make this thing happen. That's a great story. Let's get one more.
Hi, my name is Daryl Duran, and I'm an adult educator. I head up organization development at New Balance Athletic Shoe. And my story is about 4th grade, Mrs. Poole. And she was this wonderful, wonderful teacher. She was pretty strict in the classroom, but she was very into the arts, and we put on Hansel and Gretel, and I was Gretel. But I also somehow got charged with the costumes, but had no budget. So I technically knew how to sew. My sister had taught me how to use a sewing machine. So I made all the costumes out of crepe paper and sew them. And I don't even know if this material exists today, but you could buy crepe paper that was in long sheets, and it was about 3 feet tall. So I made all these aprons for Hansel and Gretel and all these costumes, and had never sewed crepe paper before. And it was just, I remember like just coming home every night and being so excited to do this. And Mrs. Poole was also really interesting because one day she took me for lunch on a Saturday, and that was like such a special thing to take a student to lunch. And I would also say my mother was quite unusual in those days. Growing up, we had, unlike anybody had, those preschool easels. We had poster paint. My mother didn't believe in coloring books. And my cousin went on to be a puppeteer and designer for the Muppets, and all of us ended up working, the 2 cousins next door and my sister all ended up working in the arts. I'm the only one in business, but I'm head of OD, so I do it all the time in the classroom. But I really think it was a lot of my mother who was very unique. And she grew up at a time, my mother's 89 now, when they tied her left hand behind her back because she was left-handed. And it wasn't until her mother, who only had an 8th grade education, told the teacher that no longer would that be allowed, that my mother could use her left hand in about 6th grade.
Wow. Keep the microphone for a second. You know, Daryl?
Daryl.
So, Daryl, did you ever tell Mrs. Poole what impact she had on you?
No, and I think she retired a couple of years later and moved to Florida. Yeah. So I'm not sure whatever, you know, she was older at the time I had her.
Dory, did you ever tell that 7th grade teacher the positive impact she had on you? No. So I think most of us don't. Most of us don't. Think back on your educational experiences. I'll bet that each of you sitting here can think of one teacher at least. Among all the teachers who might have had a negative impact on your creativity, my guess is that each of you has at least one teacher who was a trumpeter for you. Think about if that person might still be alive. Reach out and thank him or her. Tell them what they did. Tell them what the impact they had. But I'm going to ask you, even more importantly, keep your own stories in mind throughout this day. Your negative ones, keep your positive ones in mind as well. Discuss them with each other during the breaks. Share your stories with each other. Compare them to the stories that you're going to be hearing from the innovators who are going to be up here. And most importantly, ask yourself, what does this mean? What do these stories mean for education, for what we can do, for what I personally can do, for what we as a community can do to foster creativity through the educational experiences that our kids and our young people are going to be having in the 21st century? What can we do that will help children's creativity to not only survive their educational experiences, but to actually thrive during those educational experiences and for the rest of their lives? That's what we need for the society. That's what we need for the world. Thank you very much.